Good morning. Good evening. In today's discussion, we're going to be looking at all right, chill out for a sec. Got the cat here is making lots of noise. Welcome back. Nice to see you. Whatever that means over YouTube, but let's get back into it. Chapter 8. I'm going to try to bridge the gap between the courses with this presentation and make this point that for a long time developmental psychology has been focused on, or not just for a long time. The cat made me say that. That wasn't part of my unplanned rant. The main focus has been on those early years, right? Like obviously the whole development of the brain and one of the reasons there's so much time spent in developmental psychology courses on the first few years is because of the incredible structural and functional changes that happen in the brain. I'm just gonna move this so the cat doesn't touch it. Now in this section of the course, I'm going to continue that into adulthood, right? And as in the next few days, I'll be giving you the full kind of syllabus and my plan for this course. But for this specific presentation, my plan is to look at this period that we call or that I'm going to refer to as emerging adulthood, this period of transition from teen to adult, right? And let's get into it. I'm going to start off with the topic of topics, right? Identity. And maybe this is the point to start with. The true self is not the self that the ego. Oh, darn, what's the quote? True self is not the self. There's a Carl Jung quote that I just butchered, but that's basically saying there's a difference between your identity and yourself. You're someone that has an identity. You're not your identity. Your identity is there's someone that has that identity. And who's the someone? And in psychology, there's been different attempts to answer that question, right? And if you've taken classes from me, you know I'm a massive fan of Carl Jung, and his answer is the self. And that's sort of where that term originates largely, right? In terms of psychologically, is this concept that there's who we are and there's who everyone thinks we are and all this kind of stuff. But just you're not your thoughts or your emotions or your behavior. You're a being that can experience thought and emotion and that behaves. There's a you behind all those things. There's your behavior, your thoughts, your emotions is what I'm trying to say, right? It's who's the you, right? And this is this difference between self and identity is, Carl Jung, the great Carl Jung, thought it was it's the deepest question in psychology. He wrote one of the most complex and interesting articles. I should actually include it, but an answer to Job. And he tries to without totally, I'm already 4 minutes into the intro slide. Welcome back. Good to see you. I'm all of a sudden trying to quickly explain the answer to Job, the most complicated, maybe essay. But in that he's trying to deal with this question, this ion question. There's going to be a presentation, I might change the name, but that in development I've been calling ion, right? And this is a Carl Jung idea that This is his essay trying to look at that different. What's your identity and what's yourself, and how that's actually the most important question, and how a lot of our mental illnesses and a lot of our angst and a lot of our patterns live in our identity. And that there's something about the true self. And in this course, I want to get into that, and I want to talk about adulthood, and I want to talk about the creation of character, and I want to talk about the development of psychological resilience, right? Like how to deal with a complex social world. I want to talk about some of the pressures people are under, and hope you enjoy the ride. Cheers. I'm going to end this intro. I know you're probably praying for it. Let's get into the content. Let's get into this topic of identity. I'm going to be done for the night. It's almost midnight on Wednesday. I'm probably going to record most of this tomorrow, but cheers. It's good to be back. You're great people, and it's an honor to be your teacher. All right, let's do some lecturing. Cheers. Good to see you. Okay, so welcome to the presentation. So one of the idea, right, is that here around identity is that your identity is a self-portrait, and I want you to think for a sec what that means. Like, what do I mean self-portrait? What, like a portrait, something you paint. A self-portrait would be something you paint of yourself, and so your identity. What am I saying here? That it's your view of yourself. It's a story you tell yourself about yourself. It's who you think you are. It's not necessarily who you are, right? And you've heard me say this before, this idea of like this underlying self, but it's what you identify with, right? Like, think of it as like at the deepest level of the word, I see that as part of me. I identify with my family. I identify with my strong beliefs and my opinions and my views on things, and identify with certain key principles and values, and I identify with, teams that I like, and I identify with these things that I see as being part of sort of me. Right, and some of those things are like maybe your job or your politics or your religion or your I say they're like relationship identity. Like example would be like that. Like, who am I? It's like, well, some of who I am is like a teacher, and who, like the fact that I'm married. I think that's why I was starting to say that. But it's like we all have all these different things. So like part of who I am is a teacher and a father and a husband and a friend and a child to my parents and a uncle and to my nieces and nephews. Right, there's the sexual identity piece, there's the intellectual identity piece, how we think of our own minds. There's like a cultural piece to it. There's an interest piece to it. And then there's also like the way we conceptualize our body. So now this, not to get too deep into like proprioception, but this idea that like how you see yourself is actually I'm using the word on the screen like a portrait. It's like an idea. Your real self isn't the idea that you have about who you are. That's your identity. You're what has an identity. You're what in psychology we would call a self, right? And your self has an identity. Your self thinks it's a certain way. And some of your story of who you are, and I'm going to make the point that a lot of our mental health lives in this interaction between ourself and our identity. You're not your identity, you're yourself. The identity is it's the resulting pattern of your interaction with the world. It's this story you tell yourself about who you are. Right? And if anyone's interested in my master's thesis, I was studying martial art clubs and what made people more likely to stay involved long term and have meaningful experiences. And one of the things I was looking at was like how psychologically involved they were, and how much it was an example of this concept of serious leisure. And I also measured I had included measures of both personal identity and social identity. And if you're interested at all, you could Google Mike Mainland martial mind, like martial arts, martial mind was the name of that. But and if you flipped all the way to the end, you'd see that it's a bunch of scales. Like it's basically like a questionnaire where I have all these psychometric scales, or these attempts to measure this. It's like personality is a thing. Personality develops. Right? Personality is this interaction of you in your world. How much is it part of how you see yourself? Right? Like how much does being in your mind a martial artist, how much does that matter? How much does how you're identifying with the thing? Right, so it's like this, I kind of lost my point, not really lost it, but I kind of got like, the wind caught my point there, but like, what I'm trying to say is, it's this fundamental question of who are you and who aren't you? What do you do and what don't you do? Who do you see as like you and who isn't? What you identify with idea-wise, behavior-wise, religion-wise, politics-wise, relationship-wise, lifestyle-wise. Who are you? So this is what we're talking about in psychology when we're talking about identity. This way that who I would say Mike is. Well, Mike's an identity. Mike's the name. Yeah, Mike's the identity. So one of the sorry if all the beginnings of my slides are awkward, because I'm like still paranoid this isn't working right because of all the issues I had with PowerPoint last term, but I think I might have, knock on wood, sorted it out. Erikson thought that this question of identity was central to adolescence, right? That this was like, if there's his model, this psychosocial, or this interaction between your psychology and your societal pressures that are unique at every stage. And for the baby, it's establishing trust. And we've talked about all these, initiative and autonomy and industry. And now we're talking about this idea of identity, right? That the late teen, early adult is trying to figure out who they are. And one of the important pieces is this, how they conceptualize identity. And he thought this is his fifth developmental stage, this idea that individuals experience this tug between identity versus role confusion, right? And so what this means is, okay, so are you, when you're out with your friends, one person, and then when you're at work, you're a different person, and when you're around your parents, you're another person, and when you're around, like, whatever, your hockey team, you're a totally different person, and it's like every different role that you're playing, it's like it's confusing about, like, who you even are. You would call that, like, identity confusion. There's no stable person there, and the idea is, as you mature and as you become an adult, who you are becomes more consistent. And of course, if you're at a funeral versus if you're at a job interview, you're going to act differently, but there becomes more consistency across your kind of behavioral dimensions, right? A solid identity, you're not blowing in the wind the same way. You're like literally a more solid person. You have an identity. And he said failure to reach that identity can be linked with this, role confusion, feeling like you're constantly changing who you are based on the situation to such a level that it's like upsetting. Not like slightly, we all do it slightly. Obviously I'm different in when I'm teaching and I'm supposed to be in kind of the lead, whereas when I'm just like in normal life or whatever, right, I'm a lot more reserved, and it's that's normal. But I mean, who I am fundamentally has consistency. It's like, as that consistency develops, it's like, well, what is that consistency? It's the consistency is the identity. It's like if you were a different person every moment, that would be a complete lack of, personality, behavioral consistency, identity. There's a pattern to me that I call Mike. And some of that pattern is my thoughts and my emotions and how I see things and who I see as, what I see as interesting and intriguing, and what I'm repulsed by and just what I'm disgusted by, and this complicated personality identity exchange. Yeah, I don't know. Personality and identity are obviously not the same thing. Personality is like your style of being in person. Identity is like how you are identifying with aspects of your experience, but they're dynamically interconnected. So you will have heard this term like of an identity crisis before, right? That one of the things that Erikson thought was that during the beginning of adulthood period. Oh, just a quick side note. I'm going to try to keep these presentations a little bit more focused. I know that some of my presentations last year were super long, and that probably, I think when I first got hired at Nipissing, they said it's a 3-hour course. I was in this idea of making like a 3-hour lecture every week, and I know I can kind of tell by your feedback that it might be appreciated if I aimed a little more at like an hour and a half or something, considering that you have like associated readings or whatever. So I'm going to just try to be a bit more concise, but I can only contain the rant so much. The psychological turmoil that arises when this sense of who you are becomes like it's unglued, right? And I like that term. It's like who you were as a kid sort of has to come apart a bit so that it can be reformed as like an adult personality. And some of that is this tumultuous, this like confusing chaos-based experience of high school and like what we call the teen years and early adulthood. But part of that is you becoming you. There's an important piece of that it's actually central to your maturation, to your process of maturing as a person. That you have to almost go through this identity crisis to find out who you are. So here's another quick side note. I said I was going to try to not have a ton of quick side notes, but just a quick feedback piece. It's like it's nice to be back at it. I was so impressed with your group last term. You were honestly an awesome group, and really cool, unique, interesting people. And I'm not just saying that. It's like it can be a cold world, It's like, but I don't know. I just really enjoyed like your assignments, and not just like all your assignments is equally. Like I think the one I probably enjoyed the most was the last one, and some of the ones where your personalities came out a bit, and it's like, oh, what a neat group. The idea is that who we think we are isn't some random thing. It's a formation process, right? What does it mean to formate? It's like such a random thing, but this back scratcher. This is actually an epic back scratcher, by the way. Boom. But this back scratcher has a form, right? It's like how it was made. It was formed. It's like, well, what's that mean? It means like there was like a process through which it formed. Formation. It's like, you know what that word means, but it's interesting to just like break it down for a second and be like, well, it's actually kind of interesting. Who you are is actually the result of a whole string of connected experiences, right? And so I want to introduce you here to the work of someone named James Marcia and this idea of how identity formation actually happens, or he calls it adolescence identity formation, although it's just as relevant for other time periods of life, although it's like, I guess, highlighted during adolescence, that we go through these crises and are forced to make commitments. So he's basically saying like you get put in situations and you make decisions, and those decisions start to shape who you are and what you do. Okay, so now we have to look at this as a long-term pattern recognition process that starts to see, it's like you're watching yourself live your life, and you're learning the story of who this person is, that you are. It's your self-portrait. And that, so you wouldn't say it evolves, you'd say it develops would be the correct language, because development is basically saying evolves, but within one lifespan. Another thing that students, especially students that were in the course before, will realize is that this section of the course, like not section of the course, but this course 2107 is, I would say, more conceptual or theoretically based, just in the sense that now we're talking about adulthood, right? It's a little bit less about how, the lungs and the heart are getting bigger as the 2-year-old's aging, and it's a little less like that, although we're still going to talk about stuff like that. Right, but a little bit more is getting at this conceptual aspect, some of these deep meanings. Like, really, identity starts right from the beginning. Like, attachment is the original identity. The original identity is mom. There starts to be this development of the sense of self, like we even talk about in that course, how the kid sort of doesn't have a, the mere recognition idea. It's like sense of self begins around 3 months, but like they're not going to really sort of know that makeup on their nose is actually. So in case you don't know what I'm talking about, I'm saying how, like, if you put a bit of makeup on a kid's nose and then put them in front of a mirror, if they're like under a year and a half, most of them won't do anything, but if they're over 3, all of them will wipe it off. And there's this like weird period between like a year and a half and 2.5 where kids start to, for whatever reason, start to realize that it's themselves they're looking at in the mirror. That's self-awareness, that they're their own person. But there was obviously a time before that, right? So we think that by about 3 months the baby's starting to get some of that. But what does it mean to be psychologically attached to mom? What would that mean from an identity perspective? And this is sort of my point, that identity begins with attachment. Then it goes this. I wrote this really weird in the slide. Like, then there's the development of the sense of self. Like, I could have had these in points. Then there's the emergence of this like increased amount of independence in infancy. Right, and it's like all the stuff we would talk about is like adult identity that we're going to talk about today, and then it's like even all the way to the end of life when we're talking about like thinking back over your life and stuff like that. It's like that's all identity too. And Marcia said it's this, to one interesting way to talk about it. And this is where it's like a bit different too than like the other course, where maybe in the other course we're talking about like the visual cortex or the prefrontal cortex, and with these like very specific parts of the brain, what they very specifically do. And now here we're talking a little bit more about dynamics, how these deep interconnected things function, right? How we actually go through these crises and these commitments. So he says you basically get confronted with situations, and I kind of have said this a couple times, but I'm almost on the slide. You get confronted with these situations. You're dating someone, and you're not very religious, but their family's really religious, and to get married, it's important for them that you're the same religion. So the person that you're dating wants you to become part of their church. Marcia would say this is an example of like originally his term was crisis, but he's later changed it to exploration, just out of a recognition that it's not always like a negative thing, right? Like, who knows, maybe that's a positive thing, but if you don't want to change religion, and if you're a different religion, that's definitely a crisis, right? Then he says you have a choice, then you have to commit. Like, what are you going to do? Are you going to do it or not? And you have to commit to one of those choices. He says like this times a million is sort of how you get an identity. You keep having these situations. That's obviously a fairly extreme one. There's way more minute ones, but it's like you go through these situations and you make commitments to certain ways of being, certain ways of thinking, certain ways of interacting with people, certain maybe political or religious or philosophical ideas. And this is what we mean by identity. It's like this, your complex pattern of thought, emotion, behavior, that's a outward expression of who you think you are. Your self-portrait, to keep coming back to that word. Your own drawing of yourself in your head. If you were the director and you created the character of you in your movie, who are you? Let's explore this process a little more. Okay. Identity, sorry, I got a visitor. Here, wait, this is maybe the first time he's been on Nipsing camera. If I can get this angle right with the webcam. Oh, here we go. Can you say hi? Look over at the screen. Aw, can't get him quite to turn his face. He's just, oh, there you go. This is getting you a weird camera angle, but okay. There's Scotty for you. Actually, I think I showed him at the beginning of the video, maybe. Anyways, he's my sidekick here, sitting beside the computer. As long as he's not playing with wires, he's all good. Identity achievement. That little rant gave you some time to write that down. This is, okay, so now I'm trying to look at Marcia's 4 things, right? So he's basically saying that in any situation you can be in one of 4 categories. And to explain this, I want to use an example, keep going on that religion example, right? So let's say that's the scenario. You're dating someone that's very religious and you want to get married, but they're saying they want you to be that religion to marry, right? And maybe you decide, okay, I'll switch to that religion, and you do it. Or you decide, I'm not going to do that. Either way, Marcia would say you've achieved identity in that area. Either you're somebody that's now that religion, or you're someone that's, still what you were. Either way, you've sort of responded to that crisis, right? You've responded to that directional challenge of your identity. The person's been through some kind of crisis and reached some kind of commitment to an idea or an occupation or a goal, or you basically are going to do a certain thing or not. So notice how it's like, it doesn't necessarily matter if like you do change or you don't change, the fact that you've made a strong decision in one direction. Making a strong decision and making a commitment is sort of like saying a similar thing, right? So if it's easier to think of it in that way, think of it as the crisis is the situation that presents itself that demands an answer, and then the commitment is what your answer is, what direction your decision goes. Okay. Okay, quit that. I hope you guys can't hear that. He's like licking the little stand thing I have the thing on, but anyways, he stopped. The moratorium. So moratorium means like in between. So this is like the situation where that same example, you've been asked to like change your religion to marry the person. That might sound wild, but like even one generation ago, like my dad grew up Catholic, my mom was Protestant. To marry my mom, my dad became Protestant. It's like it's not in a lot of parts of the world, it's a huge consideration, right? Like, so anyways, and it's just to be honest, it's just an easy example. There's a lot of other examples too. But let's say you don't know what you're going to do. You want to be with the person, right? But you want to stay true to maybe to even make it more complicated. It's not that you're not religious. It's that you're a different total religion, right? You're a Hindu dating a Christian and or whatever direction, right? It's like not that it's what do you do? What if it's an identity you don't basically what I was saying is what if it's an identity you don't want to set down to pick up another one? But what if you also don't want to lose the person? And so Marcia would say you're in a moratorium, you're in an in-between place. It's the identity of a person who's in the crisis, right? So you've had the situation happen, you've been confronted with the decision dilemma, but you haven't made your decision yet. You're in between. Okay, so you'd say like, and you might be on these, you might be at different stages on different things at the same time, but he's saying that like the difference between the top one and the bottom one, both of those situations, you've been confronted with the issue. The difference is with achievement, you've made a decision. With moratorium, you haven't. So an easy way to put this in your notes, or a good additional thing to add to your notes is because there's going to be 2 more I'm going to show you. With each of them, it's like, is there a commitment? Is there a crisis and is there a commitment, right? Is there something that's forcing an issue and is there a decision? But just go with the word crisis, commitment, right? So the first one, we would say, yes, there's a crisis and there's a commitment. The second one, there's a crisis, no commitment. Okay, then I'll show you the third and fourth on the next slide. Okay, so at risk of using this example to death, I think 2 more things. Foreclosure. Let's say you're a Catholic and you're dating a Catholic, and it's important for them that they marry somebody that's their same faith, and you already are their same faith, you've already made that commitment, you didn't have to go through that crisis. It's like the decision was made before the question was even asked. It's foreclosed. It's closed before. I don't know if that's literally, I don't know if that just worked well as a freestyle. I don't know if foreclosure literally means it's before closed, but actually, yes, it does. It means it's closed before it happens. It's like before closed. Weird that if you ask me why it's not just before closed, why the word foreclosed exists, it's like, I don't know. I'm fascinated with that stuff though, like the history of the English language. Anyways, that's the exact kind of rant I'm going to try to control a bit for the purpose of this. Although that's like my personality too, right? And I don't want to become a slide reader. I'm not just a slide reader, I hope, right? Trying to breathe some life into it. It's like, okay, so I think you get that, right? So it's like the decision was made before it started. There was no crisis. So if you were to put in your notes, no to the crisis, but yes to the commitment, right? That is a part of their identity, that religious piece. And then the final one is called identity diffusion, right? Like spread out, like if you poured some liquid on a desk and it spreads out, diffuses out. It's like it spreads. This idea of, well, it's never come up. It's like you're not even dating anyone and you're not religious. So this whole discussion makes no direct relevance to you. You have he would say you have, it's not that you don't have an identity there, you have like this diffused identity. You've never really pushed yourself around the religious topic, you've never, let alone, and you're maybe not even dating, so it's like this worry about being the same faith as the person you're going to marry is like super low on your concern list because your life's not, demanding that of you. You're probably dealing with other things. So that would just be an example. That person's dealing with identity in all kinds of other areas, but in terms of in relation to like their faith relationship aspect of their life, they're not. So you'd say in that area they have like identity diffusion. The identity status of a person who's not in the midst of a crisis has made no commitment. It's not a huge part of who they are. It's not even really a part of who they are. So you'd say for this one that there's no crisis and no commitment. Okay, so just real quick, this is just showing the same thing in a graphical representation or image representation. Yes, it's a picture. You ever heard of it? No, I don't know why I said it like that. But there's like, is there the crisis or not? Is there the commitment or not? If there is a crisis and there is a commitment, it's achievement. If there is a crisis and there's no commitment, it's foreclosure. If there's no crisis and no commitment, it's moratorium. And if there's a crisis and no commitment, or no crisis and no commitment, it's diffusion. Moratoriums, there is a crisis and there's no commitment. I said that one wrong. So now just think about this for a sec, because what would be a logical style of a test question? Maybe to give you a situation of a person and ask you which one. Watch the PowerPoints. You gotta watch the PowerPoints. Okay. Next. I think I'm gonna cut it off here because I think this is working well, and I'm about halfway through, so I might turn this into two 35-minute presentations or whatever. So catch you in the next video, part 2. I'll probably release them together. So please click on the next video. Hope you're doing well. See you there. Cheers.